And the most important information you need to be armed with are what types of seasonings and stocks are likely to be used in food. So you're really alive to what those things that might be within dishes that aren't necessarily visible. Trust me, there are so many people with stuff sitting in their cupboard that you can borrow and use. Ask your friends, put a shout out on Facebook or what have you, whatever you use, borrow stuff. You don't need to buy a whole lot of stuff new to travel. You don't need much equipment to travel. You can travel light.
Hello and welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast, where we have inspiring conversations with amazing individuals from all around the world and look for ways to create a clean, green and sustainable future for us, the planet and all beings. I'm your host, Tom Simak, a fellow athlete and plant eater who's here to facilitate these impactful conversations. At the beginning, that was Erica Kritikides, the Culinary Product Manager at Intrepid Travel. What we'll be talking about today is pretty simple: food travel sustainability. As the world opens up, travel will become more and more accessible and affordable and possible overall. So I thought this conversation was well-rounded and well-suited for the current state of the world. So I will be very clear that the first half of this episode is more surrounding food and travel tips, and the second half of the episode is more relevant to those who are actually looking to travel with Intrepid and are interested in the company themselves. I do press quite a bit on what makes them so sustainable. Why do they think they're sustainable? How do they track that? So it is more around the company themselves. So feel free to listen to the whole episode. Otherwise, you can pick a half that suits you best. With all that being said, I hope you enjoy this conversation between Erica and I will see you on the other side. Erica, welcome to the Plant Paradigm Podcast. How are you going?
Very well, thank you. Fantastic to be here.
Lovely to have you. I thought the best way to kind of set the stage and preface for this conversation was just to do an intro on who you are and what it is you do.
Thanks, Tom. Well, I think I should start by saying I am an avid foodie and grower, and that's probably the most important thing to know about me. But the second thing is that I do maybe have one of the best jobs in the world, which is overseeing the global product range for Intrepid Travel. For those of your listeners and viewers who may not be familiar with Intrepid, we're the world's largest adventure travel company. We're also the world's largest travel B-Corp, and I can talk a bit about what that means a bit later on. But effectively, my day-to-day job is overseeing the trips that we run here at Intrepid. We have over 900 trips that we run around the world in nearly 100 countries. So it's a very diverse range of products, and we have trips for all different types of travelers. So we have cycling trips and walking trips and family trips. And I think what we'll talk a bit about here today is food trips. So it's a really exciting role. I'm very, very fortunate to work at Intrepid and do this this very inspiring, albeit very at times stressful thing from day to day.
I love it. So I think a lot of people relate to the fact that you're a foodie. I definitely identify as a foodie myself, and I would be doing a disservice to everyone listening and watching if I didn't ask how in the world you can fall into a position like that where you talk and live food just for a living.
Oh, look, I want to tell you it was through my dogged ambition, but I must say it was actually in many ways a lot of lucky breaks along the way. In my former life, I was the program manager at the International Melbourne Food and Wine Festival. So I do have a background in food and events. And out of the blue, I received a call one day from now a very close friend of mine who happened to be the product manager at Intrepid Travel at the time, who was the mother of a good friend of mine, saying, "I heard you're a foodie. We're looking for a foodie to start some food trips at Intrepid Travel. Would you like to come and have a chat?" I really had not a lot of understanding of Intrepid Travel at the time. But this wonderful woman, Robin Nixon, saw something in me and said, "Come along for the ride." And 10 years later, here I am, and it's been the most absolutely wonderful, life-changing experience working for this company. But it really was one of those lucky breaks out of the blue, who and taking a chance. And here I am.
That's so cool. I'm sure a lot of people are jelly of that. But anyone who applies themselves, I suppose, can do anything. So, like you alluded to earlier, food is something we'll be talking a bit about today, specifically the food trips and travel in general, which I think is actually good timing given as the world is starting to open up slowly. Thankfully, for for a lot of people, that's a big source of gratitude. But for a majority of us listening, watching, myself included, we're either plant predominant, or in my case, plant exclusive. So I think travel can come synonymous with anxiety. What am I going to eat? How am I going to travel? The language barriers and different issues that can arise from traveling to these different places. It's a whole different world. You don't have your kitchen, your comfort things, and you can't control, in a lot of these cases, your environment, and or it's even just the lack of knowing that causes this anxiety. So I wanted to start with food as a category of something we can talk about. So, in your experience, would you say there are certain sectors or countries in the world that are very easy to be plant based at?
Oh, this is one of my favorite questions. I've answered this question so many times over my time in culinary travel. Yes, there are. Most countries you can find good vegan food, but certainly some countries are a lot easier than others. The countries that you tend to go for first are India, Sri Lanka. These are destinations where vegan food culture, vegetarian food culture, to be perfectly honest, but vegan food culture more specifically, are quite common across the country. So, I'm just thinking about one of my all-time favorite Indian snacks, pani puri, which is this incredibly delicious, crunchy vegetarian-based shell, and it's full of potatoes and minty pomegranate water, fully vegan. It's
So
it's
cool.
not something that you necessarily have to think about. And there's estimates that up to 5 to 10% of the Indian population overall may well be vegan, and certainly being vegetarian is very, very common there. So India is certainly the first one. Sri Lanka is another one where you can get some absolutely spectacular vegetarian cuisine. Um, I think there's lots of other destinations I can point to that might feel a little bit counterintuitive. Thailand, Italy, um, South Korea, Mexico. And there's some really great resources, I think, to help vegan travelers if they're particularly interested in finding certain restaurants. I'm thinking of a website called The Happy Cow, which I know that your listeners will be familiar with. That's a great resource, I think, if you're looking for specific places to eat. But no matter where you're going, I think the key thing is do your research. If you're a foodie, use your recipe books, read your recipe books first, or just do a Google on the cuisine. So you go actually knowing, firstly, what dishes are common. And the reason that's important is you've got to get a base understanding of what ingredients may be in those dishes. The key challenge, I think, when you're traveling and eating as a vegan is really getting an insight into what base ingredients are going into foods. And the most important information you need to be armed with are what types of seasonings and stocks are likely to be used in food. So you're really alive to what those things that might be within dishes that aren't necessarily visible. I'm thinking of things like fish sauce or chicken stock or fish stock, things that are really quite common across global cuisine, but particularly if you're looking at, say, some Southeast Asian cuisines. You know, fish sauce is obviously a salt and can be quite commonly used. Just knowing that, going armed with that knowledge and being able to ask that question, does this have X in it, is really helpful. It also helps you understand how to ask for a modified version of a dish. So I'm thinking of South Korea as an example. Now, South Korea can be tricky. when you're eating vegan, but it's a cuisine that's very component based. So dishes tend to be made up of lots of smaller things. So if you know what to take off a dish, because you know what the base ingredients are, that can be really helpful. So some of your listeners might be familiar with a dish called bibimbap, which is a rice dish. Beautiful, beautiful looking dish. And it's topped with lots of different ingredients. Most of them, in fact, predominantly, they are vegan toppings. Often it's served with beef or with an egg. If you know that, you know you can just ask to have it without beef, without the egg, and you're faced with this most delicious vegan dish. So I think that research and just knowing some of those core dishes, seasoning, sauces really can help a lot, just arming yourself with the facts when you're eating. The other thing I know that's more difficult to achieve is watching the preparation of your food. So if you're, for instance, using eating street food, being able to see what ingredients are being used to prepare that dish can be incredibly helpful, because then you can make an informed decision about what you are eating. But my top tip, my absolute number one top tip for any vegan traveler is when you arrive in a new place, take a food tour. Take a food tour, because that is going to give you access to a food expert. Most likely, you're going to go through a local food market, ask a lot of questions. And so you'll get really a good sense of what the base ingredients are from a local, and you can ask some questions about what those things that you might need in terms of language or things to look out for in the dishes that you're eating, and just getting that local insight. I mean, I know from our standpoint, the reason that people love our trips, and particularly when vegan travelers take our trips, is they benefit from the expertise of their local leader. So you've always got someone to ask, what's in this? Or you can use their expertise, obviously, in the local language to just interrogate what is in a dish, because it is hard. It is really hard, but I think those are a few things that you can do to make it a lot easier.
100%. I think one of the things that you really touched on that is super important is doing your research, but that could come in so many different facets. That could be learning the basics of the language, whether it's just a few words like don't put X, and just learning that, which is something a local guide can be good for, which is something the app Google Translate could be good for. There's so many different ways that you can arm yourself with the research. But
It really is. And honestly, Tom, can I tell you, having worked in culinary tourism for over 10 years, it has changed a lot. It has improved a lot in terms of the overall awareness of what it means to be vegan, what ingredients that doesn't include, as in, honey and those types of things. But I recognize there are still challenges. So there's been a huge amount of improvement, I think, in awareness, particularly in certain places. But there is still a ways to go. And you can even download cards on the internet in local language that do specifically say, I'm vegan, I do or don't eat these types of things. So you can actually show someone as well in a local destination. So you've got that card, because language is often the number one barrier here that people have to contend with. And that can be very, very helpful. I know particularly with my own pronunciation in certain languages, even if I did know the local words, it wouldn't be particularly effective. So sometimes having it written down helps as well.
yeah, definitely. I mean, what you touched on is super important. The fact that they might, like, the understanding has come a long way, but there is still discrepancies, especially with the translation of the language. And of course, it comes into their own culture and what that means. Like when we're in Fiji, we can say vegan or vegetarian, but they'll still serve you fish, because they don't really understand, they don't associate meat with fish. And different cultures, obviously, different things. Like Thai don't really get the fact that fish sauce wouldn't be veggie. So I really think that's an important point.
Yeah, it really is. And I think even certain dishes, and I really don't want to build any fear that
Mm.
listeners might have about traveling vegan. I encourage you to do it. I know it can be done, and it can be done really, really well, which is why I was talking about pani puri before and just absolutely salivating at the thought of this most delicious dish. Um, but it is important to be aware that even if you think you know the base ingredients of a dish, and kimchi is a great example of this. This is a fermented cabbage dish using gochujang, which is a type of chili paste, absolutely delicious. If you're in Jeonju, which is Korea's foodie capital, they can also put fish sauce in there. So it is important to have that list. It is important to ask those questions and not just assume, particularly if it's something very, very important to you to get right. Do continue to ask those questions, even if you do think you know the ingredients in a dish.
Well, I had no idea about the kimchi thing. And fish sauce is such a particular thing to put on, say, like a card. If we visualize a card, you'd think you'd put no meat, no fish, no dairy, no eggs, no honey. But then you got like fish sauce and like small little like oyster sauce, these little categories that are just those little slip ups that just catch you off guard. So that is a really important point.
But if you've done your research, you can add them to the card because you'll know that they're a really dominant ingredient in that culture. So if you were traveling anywhere in Southeast Asia or even just East Asia, having fish sauce on your list, no fish sauce, will also be really helpful. So if you've done your research, you've got it on your list, you can be much more comfortable knowing that you've covered that off.
100%. I mean, we touched on the easiest places to travel, which, look, I know you can probably get around the whole world at this stage and not starve to death as someone who's veggie. But are there particular places that it is especially difficult?
Look, traditionally, people have said it is very difficult in countries like Mexico, countries like Peru, South America. Argentina is one that comes to mind, but I just don't want. I'm really actually even hesitating to say or name these countries because I know that you can actually travel there really well um, as a vegan if you do your research and if you come armed with the information you need to get to the right foods. And if you do that food tour at the start of your trip, or if you're lucky enough to be traveling with a local or on a food tour like what we offer, there's absolutely no reason that you cannot eat really, really well as a vegan. I think, generally speaking, there's a much higher interest in plant-based eating than there ever has been, and that's obviously to do with climate change. I think is really feeding that. Obviously, in addition to just growing awareness around the deliciousness of eating in that way as well. So I've named a few,
Mm,
but please don't let that put you off. I just believe that if you've got that, that expert or someone that can help guide you at the start of your journey through that country, there's absolutely no reason that you should have anywhere on your do not travel list as a vegan.
yeah, I love that optimistic and hopeful thought, and I couldn't agree more. Now, obviously, you mentioned something super important. A lot of people are shifting to plant-based diets due to, well, there's a number of reasons. One of them are environmentalism and the CO2 impact that food can create. So if I'm going to go travel, I want to eat plant-based to not support these highly, I guess, carbon-intensive industries. I'm not going to go there and then just get a bunch of plastic water bottles or these other environmentally toxic things like that. So there's lots of other traps people can fall into. And one that I'll kind of start, and I want to hear what you have to say around this kind of topic, but I'm going to around Southeast Asia for a few months starting next week, and I've bought a Steri pen, which for those who don't know, this can save up to 70 to 80,000 water bottles because it kills the bacteria, viruses, and protozoa in your water. Because a lot of Asia, they just live on plastic water bottles because they don't have, like, for example, the chlorine content that Western societies would do. But kind of piggybacking off that tip, do you have any other general environmental or maybe climate friendly travel tips for us?
I love this question. This really speaks to the core of what we talk about so much here at Intrepid. You've named the first one, which is bring your own water bottle. And I love your Steri pen as well. That's even better. It's so easy to do. We often get asked, well, why don't you give out water bottles at the start of your trips? And we're like, no, what we're trying to do is not create any more stuff. We know that so many of our customers and our travelers have their own water bottles at home. Please bring them. The other thing that we encourage is refuse plastic bags. Bring your own reusable carry bag, whether that's for shopping or what have you, over and above your backpack, just so you've got a carry-all while you're traveling and you don't need any plastic bags. It's just one of the easiest things that you can possibly do. One that I really, really love, and this is a newer one that's come into my travel tip kit, is borrow stuff. Please borrow stuff. Often when people are going on particularly more expedition style trips, whether that's, an intensive walking trip or, a long trip where you need a big pack and a bit more serious equipment, so often people go out and they buy it all new and then it just sits in your cupboard. Trust me, there are so many people with stuff sitting in their cupboard that you can borrow and use. Ask your friends, put a shout out on Facebook or what have you, whatever you use, borrow stuff. You don't need to buy a whole lot of stuff new to travel. You don't need much equipment to travel. You can travel light. That's a really important one that's coming into my orbit. When you're traveling on the ground, use public transport. It's really amazing as a real life experience on the ground, exposes you to local culture in a completely different way, and it is a much less carbon intensive way to travel. And something we are talking about more at Intrepid is reducing what we're calling non-essential flights in our trips. And so, if you can travel overland, please do. Most of the carbon output comes from takeoff and landing. So most of us will need to fly. You'll no doubt be flying to Southeast Asia on your trip.
Swimming. Come on, get the
You're
swimming.
swimming.
Yeah,
Oh,
swimming.
look, you're putting me to shame now. So
No.
for those of us who are flying,
Yeah.
we if that's the one time you fly, it is
Mhm.
what it is. We
Yeah.
do live far away, but if you can reduce that takeoff and landing aspect and potentially even stay longer as you are in a place, immerse yourself, you're lowering the overall carbon output of your trip, and you're also experiencing more, getting more time out. Travel's also about relaxation. We forget that sometimes, and that ability to immerse yourself and be really mindful in a complete other culture is just so refreshing and rejuvenating. So obviously a couple of benefits to long travel there, but certainly there's climate benefits as well, as we see.
100%. Those local on the ground transfers they're a bit more daunting, I would say, because everyone is familiar with flying, and I get that, I understand, but the trains, the buses, the kind of forget like little boats and things that you can take to different places are just a whole little experience in itself. And I think your point is really good about slow travel. That's a really big thing that I think has become a tip of the iceberg since this new movement has come about. People don't like you come back from your trip needing a holiday from your trip because you're just exhausted. Whereas this is more climate friendly to travel slower. You get a deeper and richer cultural experience, and it's less carbon intensive, and you're actually having a good time.
It's something I think we are more conscious about here at Intrepid. We've always had a lot of long trips. Some of our trips are up to 64, 72 days long. So we've always had a lot of long trips in the portfolio. But I think particularly with the impact of COVID and a lot of borders having been closed for a long time, it really was something we celebrated as we've started to see borders open, is actually access to some of these really long trips again. And it really did get us to
Mm.
thinking, this is a whole range in and of itself, long travel. So we've just curated a new range of what we're calling long travel trips, for that reason, because we want people to get out and experience and immerse themselves on those longer style experiences if they have the time and the inclination, both because we recognize that there's a real sustainability angle here, and that's absolutely key to what we're looking to increase, but also because we're just so excited. We're so excited that you can do long trips again where you're crossing borders and seeing different countries in the one trip. So definitely a couple of benefits there.
100%. Now, we've touched on climate change a fair bit, and it's something we definitely talk a lot about on the show. Now, if someone were to go to the Intrepid website right now, there's this plant-based food section, and there's a reference to the IPCC saying there's a lot of benefit to plant-based foods. And I know, of course, a lot of us here know that this can be quite a controversial topic. And just before we move on to the actual tour itself, I was curious to know, you've got this listed on the website. Was there back and forth in terms of ideas getting thrown around to whether or not to put something like that on the website, given its controversy?
Around plant-based
Yeah,
food being in trips,
about around plant-based foods being carbon friendly.
being carbon friendly. I'm going to go back a bit actually. So Intrepid's got a really long history in sort of the recognition of our need to reduce our carbon output as a business. So I want to go back a little ways and then go into how we've actually come to this point around introducing these plant-based meals in our trips. Because no, in answer to your question, we're really excited by it. It's a really genuine move for us, but it's part of a much broader picture around how we're approaching carbon reduction across our business and across our products. I think Intrepid's journey started in 2005 around carbon reduction. And this is pretty early in the piece. And it really came out of the fact that our owner and a group of our senior managers read The Weather Makers by Tim Flannery about the future impact of climate change. Now, a lot of people are going to know that now, but that was actually, it was pretty early days. It was actually, I think, even maybe pre-Al Gore's seminars as well. So it was very early. And I think, our owners have always really strongly held true to the value of wanting Intrepid to give back to the places that we visit and be a positive thing for the planet. And so in 2010, we started carbon offsetting all of our trips. And since then, we've been the world's largest carbon neutral travel company. So we've been in this space for a long time. We've seen a lot more companies committing to carbon neutrality over that time, but it's not enough. It's not enough. We've got to do more, and we recognise that. We're seeing, obviously, the impacts of climate change across the planet. That directly affects us. It directly affects our customers and what they are experiencing. And it is something that we recognise we can do something about. We are actively looking at a whole lot of different ways that we can, over and above carbon offsetting our trips, that we can reduce the carbon impact of our products generally in our business. So what we're doing is really very much looking at the types of trips that we create and product design. So I talked a little bit about how we're reducing non-essential flights in our trips. So we have, in 2022, we took out about 6 flights from our top selling products. That's equating to about 2,000 flights that won't be taken in 2022 by our customers. That's a big reduction in carbon. Now, I know that this is a very long answer, but what I'm getting to is we were thinking about what are the other ways that we can really make an impact here, not in terms of directly reducing the carbon output, but also using our products as a platform for discussion and a platform for growing awareness. And so we then saw an opportunity with our Real Food Adventures to talk about the impact of, or the certainly the benefits of a plant-based diet when it comes to reducing carbon emissions. And we'd already had a history around vegan travel in particular. So in 2018, we'd launched 3 vegan-specific trips, and that had fantastic exposure. And so
I wanted to ask you actually how they went, because I remember there was like Italy, there was India,
there was 3 trips. Yeah, very
Thailand.
good. We did. We had Italy, India, and Thailand, and we launched those in 2018. We launched the first trip we actually took a group of vegan influencers because we recognized we knew a bit, but we didn't know everything.
Mm-hmm.
So we got them to really help us craft what is a really fantastic vegan food experience so that we really could imbue that into the other trips. And it was probably the best thing we did because whilst we had some knowledge, it was really helpful to understand actually some of those things you were alluding to before. What are some of the concerns, the anxieties, the blockers, the problems that vegan travelers experience on the road, and how can we solve those, and how can we educate our foodie leaders to solve those problems for our vegan travelers? So we launched those in 2018. Had fantastic success, particularly with the India vegan food adventure, which is not surprising in any way.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked to about India being a fantastic place for vegan travelers, and I think a lot of vegan travelers know that and were booking that product for that reason. COVID hits March 2020, and we halt operations for the first time ever. It was I can still remember the days, and even thinking about it now, it's certainly was a pretty crazy time. And as a result of that, we did reduce the number of trips that we were running at that time, and we chose to put a number of trips on hiatus. So that included our vegan food adventures. Now, really interestingly, whilst we were on hiatus with those trips, we still kept getting lots and lots of inquiries about them from all over the place, customers, media. So the most exciting thing was that really resonated with people, and it got us thinking. So we're already thinking about climate, carbon reduction. We're seeing interest in these vegan food trips, and we thought, how can we actually spread that across more of our trips? That's just 3 products, and we know that one's booking really strongly India, but how can we actually make that present across all of our food trips? And so we went to all of our ground teams, and we got them to start working on their best plant-based meal for each trip. Really fire them up. What's the absolute best vegan plant-based meal that you can come up with in Israel, in Thailand, in Peru, in Mexico, in Vietnam? We run these trips in over 25, 30 countries. So we've got lots and lots of countries to play with. And we actually already had a lot of really fantastic plant-based meals that already existed in products. Now, why this is important from a climate standpoint is not that necessarily putting a plant-based meal across every single trip is going to significantly decrease the carbon output of those products. But what it allows us to then speak to as a brand is just awareness. Why are we having these meals in our trips that celebrate fruit, vegetables, seeds, and nuts? It's because those foods, in many ways, have a much lower carbon footprint than many meat-based foods. And it just allows us to tell that story and speak to that truth across many more trips than just 3. So we get to speak to that on every single food trip that we operate and help spread that awareness with our customers. That's really powerful. We have a lot of customers that travel on those trips that may not have considered that aspect of their diet. And that doesn't mean that they're going to go home and become vegan, but it might mean that they do go home and consider reducing the number of meat-based meals that they have. And I think that's really, really powerful. We've got to think both about our products in terms of their direct carbon output, but also we think about them in terms of how we can use them as a vehicle to broader change. And I think, sorry, that is a very, very long answer to your question.
Well,
But that's why it's not controversial, I don't believe. They're
mhm.
platforms for awareness, and I think that's actually an incredibly positive thing.
Yeah. Well, there's 2 things I want to zoom in to here. Obviously, we want to educate as much as possible, which is a great starting point. Secondly, I think I want to know, and I'm sure some other people want to know, are the vegan trips coming back?
I'm never going to say never. This new feature of our Real Food Adventures, so a plant-based meal on every single food trip, that we run launched in March of this year.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the process of one of the most exciting things that we do within my department, which is review every single trip across the entire product range. And we're doing that. We do that annually. Um, just to make sure that we are absolutely ahead of the game in terms of what the experiences we're providing customers, and particularly a lot has changed post COVID as well in terms of the places that we travel to, making sure that we're really mindful of that with the trips that we operate. When we're doing that, we're always thinking about what's new, what needs to come back, and I think there has been such a strong response to these vegan food trips. What I would say is for now, all our previous vegan food trips are available as tailor-made departures. So at Intrepid, we have a specific team that can put together specialised itineraries, and we do now have that expertise within the business to be able to formulate one of these food itineraries in many countries around the world. The other thing I would say too is that we now have the ability to provide a vegan-friendly experience on really every real food adventure that we run, because we have been growing that expertise across our operations teams, across our leaders, which really means that for a vegan traveller, we've got a range of trips, even though they might not be called vegan food adventures, but that can actually cater for them. And particularly speaking again to what we were talking about at the top of our conversation, provide that support to eat really, really well in a place if that is something that someone is quite concerned by. It's basically taking care of the language barrier, and also bringing that local expertise on cuisine as well to avoid all of those pitfalls.
Mm-hmm.
So hope maybe the vegan trips will be back soon, but in the meantime, it would not preclude any vegan travellers from taking an Intrepid food adventure, because they are ready-made for really travellers of all different dietary requirements. And it's something that we've really had as part of that range since they were launched back in 2012, with all the different food guides that I remember writing back in the day about different dietary requirements. So,
Well, look forward to it. But the second
yeah.
thing I want to prong you, Erica, is you said earlier that you carbon offset your trips. Now, I want to dive into that for a second, because a lot of people say they do this. A lot of people claim they put on their website, and they, not that I'm suggesting or implying, but they greenwash. So I was curious as to how you um, can prove, or how, like, obviously B-Corp has something to do with this, and we've talked about B-Corp on the show before, but how do people know that you carbon offset, and how exactly is that even done on your end?
Oh, no, that's a really, really good question. So we, as I mentioned before, we've been carbon offsetting our business, and that's the trips and our offices, since 2010. We had our 44 offices assessed for emissions in 2020.
And who is assessing these? Is this like some third party?
It's a third-party assessor that comes and does this for us. And so, yes, we're using science-based reduction targets now, and that's to keep us in line with a 1.5
Mhm.
degree future. So we are actually using a lot of external consultants and companies to help us not greenwash in this way. We've offset over 360 tonnes of carbon emissions worldwide, and our reporting methodology is in line with Climate Active, and that was formerly known as the National Carbon Offsetting Standards, or NCOS, under the Australian government's carbon neutral initiative. So we are very much using external sources in our methodology to make sure that we are not greenwashing, and it's certainly something that we are protecting against all the time. So in terms of how we approach this, we're measuring, firstly we measure. So we're measuring the main sources of emission, both from our trips, so that's the transport, the accommodation, the waste. And when it comes to our offices, we're measuring emissions from electricity and bottled gas and natural gas, water flights, vehicles, waste paper, and so forth. The next step that we take is that we look to reduce those emissions. So I've talked about a whole lot of different things that we're doing on trip to do that. So, reducing non essential flights, encouraging travellers in sustainable practices around water bottle usage, um, plant based meals on our food trips, but certainly eating locally and seasonally,
Hmm.
reducing food miles as well. Um, in our offices, recycling, reducing the amount of travel that we're actually doing for work, really setting ourselves up as a strong virtual office. We have,
Hmm.
as I was saying, offices all over the world. We've really learned, particularly over COVID, how powerful it is to do a meeting over Teams, talking like how we are now.
Mm.
You really can make strong connections. And that has helped us reduce a lot of non essential travel as well, which we recognize we love travel. We want to travel as sustainably as possible, but we want to do it within moderation. Conservation of water is another one. Now, once we've done those two things, so we've measured, we've reduced, then we offset. And we offset our carbon emissions by purchasing carbon credits, and that's associated with a range of renewable energy projects. We have 6 key international projects that we purchase carbon credits with, and we use an external broker to identify those projects. And they include gold standard and verified carbon standard certified projects as well. And
Mm.
they are bringing, the exciting thing is that they are bringing additional economic, social, environmental benefits, including habitat and biodiversity protection. So, an example I might give you of one of those projects is we're working with the Savannah Burning Project in Arnhem Land here in Australia, and that is supporting traditional cultural burning practices to mitigate bushfires. So I think, it is really easy to talk the talk. It's really difficult to walk the walk. I think at Intrepid, we feel very fortunate that we've had over 10 years, or really over 15 years, history in this space, because it has been a learning. We're learning all the time, not only how to do things better, but also how to correct some of the mistakes you make along the way too. I think, we're all trying our best and we're striving to do the right things. Sometimes you do things that maybe aren't the best, and I think we're really lucky that we've had that history, that we're I think quite ahead in terms of where we're at. We actually have a whole unit within our business that's dedicated to responsible travel. We have a sustainability officer within our business who is, researching, advocating. We talk a lot externally about climate change, and I think we're quite well-known advocates in this space. And it has taken a lot of time and a lot of learning to put ourselves in that position. And it's probably one of the reasons that most of us are very proud to work here at Intrepid, because it is a company that does walk the walk, even though it can be pretty hard.
Yep. I want to dive into something you just said earlier, but I just want to give everyone a preface. I'm not trying to make this a long ad for Intrepid, but in particular, I want to show that this is something a business can do. And it's important, I think, to show also my line of questioning. I'm not nodding my head, but I think we should be very critical about what people say. And sorry, Erica, if I'm coming very direct like that, but I've
Fun.
seen my fair share of greenwashing. I've had to question these companies, and I've purchased something that I thought was good when in fact I was misled. So I think this is an important line of questioning we should get into the habit of. But you mentioned earlier that you're doing the best you can. Now, I would say that is probably the minimum standard that most people should hit, but there is a point which it's not good enough. I wouldn't say there's a lot of things you guys are doing which is incredible compared to um, other travel companies, given that if the environment falls apart, that's your product falling apart. So I understand the correlation and why you're invested in that. But what do you think as a company you could be doing better?
Oh, a lot of things. I think a lot of things. And I think we're making some really great steps. We recognize that probably the biggest source of carbon emission in our trips is flights. And that's something I think we grapple with all the time, and we're really trying to work our way around. So product design over time, I think, will evolve. And anything we can do, I think, to support initiatives in addition to what we're doing at the moment that support carbon neutral fuels and that type of thing is going to be really, really key, because people are still going to want to travel, and we want them to travel, and we want them to have those experiences and that cultural exchange, because that in and of itself has such strong value to mutual understanding and cultural understanding as well. And that's something we really strongly believe in here. So I think that's probably top of our list in terms of what we really need to focus on here, but also recognizing that it's a pretty challenging area, is how you get around and how you get around sustainably. And I think a lot of travelers and probably a lot of your listeners grapple with the same issue as well themselves. It's a real tension there.
Yeah, 100%. So I want to come towards the tail end of our conversation. There are a few more things I just wanted to touch on. So initially, as a disclaimer, we we're talking beforehand that these tours, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, they're not vegan exclusive. So there was previously, like we mentioned, 3 exclusive vegan tours. These are open to many people of different dietary preferences, but correct me if I'm wrong, but people who are plant exclusive can still be accommodated on these tours.
That's right. That's right. So if you're plant exclusive, the most important thing to do is just make sure that when you're booking, you say that's your dietary preference. Our leaders receive training on a range of different, I'm not going to say a different diets. So they are conscious of what they might need to deliver. And particularly when we were talking about lists at the top of our discussion, what does and doesn't constitute a vegan food experience. And that's really important to know, because there's a lot of, I think, misconception around what that is. So, no, absolutely encourage listeners, particularly if they are booking a trip, just make sure that you indicate that's what you are, and particularly if there's any additional preferences over and above that, because that is information that we take prior to travel. We read it, we look at it, we prepare for it, so that when a traveller hits the ground, we're already across what they require. It is something I think that a lot of your travellers will be familiar with, that there are some experiences, and they do exist across the Real Food Adventures range, where there are some experiences that have a meat component. There are very few of them, and I'm struggling actually to think of them as I'm talking, but to be fully disclose, read the itinerary carefully, look at the inclusions, just know when they may fall, and then just be asking the questions, is there a substitute for that activity? Do know that we're considering that on every trip we will have had a vegan. On every single Intrepid food adventure we will have had a vegan. But for you, for your experience, I think it's really important for our travellers to have read that itinerary beforehand, and particularly if they've got certain things that they feel very strongly about or are really important to them, that they know where those pain points might be, so that we can get ahead of them in advance.
Perfect. And then one last question for you, Erica, before we wrap up. We've talked a lot on this episode about different things. You've mentioned B-Corp, you mentioned climate change, plant-based food travel tips, environmental tips, carbon offsets. There's a lot of different topics that we covered. For the last minute or two, I like to leave guests with the platform fully at their own disclosure to talk about their own words of wisdom. It could be regarding the topics we talked about today, or it could be something completely irrelevant that you think would leave us with one more little golden nugget we can take away from this conversation. But the stage is all yours, Erica.
Oh gosh, Tom, thank you. What an opportunity. I think really the nugget that I'd like to leave the listeners with is actually an awareness of B Corp. If I'm honest, Intrepid is a B Corp itself, and I'm starting to see B Corps more and more in advertising across some of the Australian companies. I think we've got so much agency with how we purchase as consumers, and it's certainly, for those listeners who aren't aware of what B Corp is, it's an independent certification of businesses who want to have benefit for multiple stakeholders, and really are striving to be better for the world. Purpose beyond profit, I suppose, is probably the quickest and easiest way to put it. So I think just growing that awareness of that certification, because it is an incredibly rigorous external certification. Intrepid first got their certification a few years ago, and we've just recertified, slightly higher than our previous score. It's very hard. We had to work very hard to make sure that we covered all our bases in terms of looking after our people, a diverse supply chain, how we create value for our customers. And it's a certification I think that I would love to see more and more people be aware of, because I think it really does speak to the values of a business and something to look out for. Other than that, oh, please don't ever be worried to get out and eat around the world. I'm just imploring your listeners to do your research. Don't be worried. Um, get that food tour sorted at the start of your trip, and you are going to have the most delicious experience no matter where you go in the world.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for all the incredible tips you shared with us today. I'm sure someone's taken away a tip or two. Thank you so much for sharing your tips on plant-based goodness as well. I'm stoked to have someone such as yourself organizing the trips of a lot of these places. And I'm stoked that there is a company out there that does care, in lack of a better word. So thank you for all the work that you do, Erica, and thank you again for your time today on sharing these wisdom tips with us.
Thanks for having me, Tom. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Hi there. Welcome to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for listening and or watching the whole way through. I really hope you got some enjoyable nuggets out of the show. Thank you, Erica, for coming on and sharing your wisdom. For anyone who chooses to travel with an Intrepid trip, although this wasn't a sponsored podcast from that at all, good luck to you, and I hope you have an incredible time. And for anyone who really enjoyed the show, the podcast, have any guest suggestions, you can reach out to us on Instagram at plant.paradigm, TikTok, YouTube. If you have comments or other sustainability tips and you're on YouTube, comment below. Let's see if we can help each other out here. But with all that being said, I will see you all on next week's episode. But until then, stay happy, eat plants, peace.